In February 2003, parts of a female body are discovered by a canal in northern France.
Cases where the victims' bodies are found butchered are not very common, to say the least.
The experts determined that the body was cut up with a saw.
This crime is barbaric. You need a strong stomach to do this kind of thing.
The police identified the victim. She was a 59-year-old woman.
It wasn't easy to figure out what she was like, because she didn't have any close relatives who could talk about her.
Who would want to harm this seemingly ordinary pensioner?
When the investigators found out about Jacqueline Suka's turbulent personal life, to put it mildly, they looked into all the lovers she had accumulated.
The investigation puts the police on the trail of a Belgian serial killer nicknamed the Butcher of Mons.
The Belgians were thinking, that's it, it's starting again. They were scared. They said to each other, he's come to the north of France.
Eventually, a business owner, the victim's neighbor, becomes the focus of the investigators' attention.
If my client hadn't owned a sawmill, there's every reason to think they would never have been interested in him.
The hard work of the Lille Homicide Unit hasn't opened many leads, but not all of them have been closed. Who killed Janine Suka? We're in Loquignol, a small town located in Nord Pas-de-Calais, a few miles from the Belgian border. It was here, on the banks of the Escaut Canal, that one of the most disturbing cases of recent years began in February 2003 with the discovery of human remains. The police in charge of the investigation ended up connecting it to the disappearance of a retired 59-year-old woman. Her name, Janine Suka. Who killed this woman? Why was her body cut up? Is this murder connected to a Belgian investigation into a serial killer who the press nicknamed the Butcher of Mons? Today, all these questions are still unanswered. We're looking back at a case that remains unsolved to this day. On Tuesday, February 25, 2003, at 8:30 a.m., at the Loquignol Center for Water Sports, it's the start of a beautiful day. At this time of day, few people walk or fish on the banks of the Escaut Canal. Frederick Guillon maintains the green spaces by the canal. For him and his team, it's the start of a workday like any other.
The ranger we worked with dropped me and my colleague off at the place where we pruned, cleaned, and mowed all the green spaces.
As usual, the maintenance worker starts to clean the banks. Then something unusual catches his eye.
The banks are easily 200 yards long. That's where we found the notorious bag, on the bank, drenched with water.
Intrigued by the presence of the bag, as well as its volume, the workers decide to open it. Inside, they discover a large stone and two other bags.
Given the color of what was in it, white, we thought it might be an animal. We noticed there was a heel. This was something else. This wasn't an animal.
The two workers realize they have just fished out a human limb.
We saw the rest of the foot. That's when we thought, these really were human body parts. That's how it all began.
Alerted by the manager of the maintenance team, police officers from the neighboring communities of Berlemont and Avesnes-sur-Helpe immediately head to the canal.
We saw the first police car arrive on the scene. And after that, there was a full-on procession of police cars.
The investigators find that the bags contain the lower part of a woman's leg and an arm with a hand severed. Bernard Baffy was the public prosecutor in Avesnes-sur-Helpe. He clearly remembers the very beginnings of the case.
The police questioned everyone who regularly went there. At that time of year, it was still February, and it was cold. Visitors were rather rare. So, first and foremost, the people responsible for maintaining the banks of the Sambre were questioned. And they gave the most interesting statements. As they said that the day before, they had cleaned the area and they hadn't come across the bag.
The bag was therefore brought here overnight or in the early morning of February 25th. The police questioned the workers to figure out whether the bag could have drifted with the current. They try to establish where exactly the body parts were dumped.
There was no current or anything at that time. The locks are only in operation in the summer for the boaters. In my opinion, it couldn't possibly have drifted with the current.
The police therefore decide that the bag was dumped near where it was found. They focus their inspection on this part of the canal, between a bridge and a small flood barrier. Florence Delphine, a reporter for La Voix du Nord, covered the beginnings of this investigation.
We were in suspense. At this stage of the investigation, all the police forces were in the forest around the Sambre. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack.
While dredging the canal, police divers think they have found other human remains. 540 yards from the site of the discovery, they recover another black garbage bag. They're convinced they have found another body part. But the bag contains only rosaries and other religious objects. These surprising items are immediately placed in evidence bags. Nearby, the investigators also discover 2 red roses in wrapping paper, along with a Valentine's Day card.
Unfortunately, no. These objects don't actually tell us anything. No, nothing. We're still trying to find a connection with the case, some kind of lead to follow.
A week after the discovery of the arm and the leg, the police still haven't found any other human remains. The identity of the victim or victims is still a mystery. On March 3, 2003, the Public Prosecutor's Office of Avesnes-sur-Helpe opens a legal investigation into first-degree homicide. The next day, a man walking his dog in the town of Vieux-Conde, 37 miles from Locquignol, makes another macabre discovery. This time, it's a female torso, washed up on the banks of the Escaut Canal. The Valenciennes police immediately head to Vieux-Conde.
The police officers again carry out a number of searches around the site of discovery, upstream and downstream, to see if there are any other human remains, other parts of this body. But they find nothing.
Unlike the Sambre, the Scheldt is a wide canal nicknamed the Highway because of the amount of traffic it gets. Albert is the keeper of the Denane Lock, a few miles from Vieux-Conde. His colleagues are questioned by the investigators who are trying to understand if, like before, the torso was dumped at the place where it was found, or if it could have been dragged in the wake of a boat.
When a motorboat is on the water, it makes a surge of current with the propeller. So if there's a foreign object, whether it's a bag or a piece of wood or whatever, it can get caught in the propellers and get stuck under the hull. This can go on for half a mile or 5 miles.
Thanks to the lockkeeper's testimony, the police understand that the torso found in Vieux-Conde may have been dumped within a radius of several miles around the spot where it was discovered. The search for other human remains or valuable clues therefore proves to be difficult.
Given the size of the river and the multiple places the torso could have come from, they abandoned the search rather quickly, because it was a search that, barring an extraordinary stroke of luck, couldn't lead to finding other parts of the body.
Olivier Urban has covered the entire investigation for the Avnoise Observer. The beginnings of this unusual case made a particular impression on him.
This is unprecedented for us as journalists. Personally, I've been doing this job for more than 15 years. Clearly, this is unprecedented. They've never found remains scattered like that all over the place. We realize this is a story that's out of the ordinary. It's in the headlines for weeks.
There had been other crimes, settlings of scores and everything. But a dismembered arm and leg in plastic bags, that was something we'd never seen before.
It's heavy going, because in an article, we can stay objective and say, this part was found in such and such a place. In a way, we're protecting ourselves when we say that, because there's a real dread, a real fear. There are even people who call us and say, on that day, I heard screams, even though it isn't true. But people are starting to construct their own narrative and are really getting worried.
With an arm, a leg, and a torso found a week apart in different places, the investigators are now facing a real human jigsaw. Samples are taken and sent to Nantes Hospital's Biological Institute to carry out DNA fingerprinting on the different body parts. At the same time, several medical examiners are called in. The human remains found in Loquignol and Vieux-Conde are examined separately at the Lille and Valenciennes Forensic Institutes. Bernard Marc is a forensic pathologist. He has agreed to tell us about the challenges the examiners faced.
In this case, there's an upper limb with a section of the hand, a torso, and a section of the lower limbs which have been cut off. There are only fragments of information. Interpreting this is a lot harder than in an autopsy of a whole body. Of course, here, time has altered things. And the dismemberment also significantly affects the conclusions.
The specialists conduct an external examination of the body parts. They start by looking for biological traces that could help identify the perpetrator.
They obviously try to find DNA or fingerprints. Unfortunately, they don't find any.
The medical examiners then notice lesions. The torso has 4 linear wounds around the nipples.
A linear wound is most likely caused by a sharp object, which can be very wide. It can be a thin blade. It doesn't penetrate, so it doesn't go beyond the dermis.
These superficial wounds can't have killed the victim. The medical examiners continue searching for the cause of death.
Of course, lots of things are missing. The head. There could be a projectile in the head. The neck. Are there signs of strangulation or a blow to the neck? It's impossible to say. But these are the areas where fatal injuries most often occur. The only usable element is the torso.
The specialists discover lesions on the victim's lungs. They conclude that she was probably asphyxiated. They then try to determine how the body was cut up.
Was the same tool used? Are the cross-sections anatomical, done by someone knowledgeable, or, on the contrary, have they been cut roughly?
Additional examinations are requested.
The medical examiner is assisted by all the police's forensic laboratories and specialists. Anthropologists, for example, give extremely interesting insights on the dismembered bones.
Officer Frank Nolot is an expert in anthropology at the National Gendarmerie's Criminal Research Institute, where the human remains found in Loquignol and Vieux-Conde were examined. He has agreed to reveal to us the techniques used by his department.
When we receive evidence containing soft, muscular, or other materials, we have to strip them and remove these different soft tissues so we can only see the bones. We do an examination with binocular magnifiers at different magnification levels to see if there are ridges on the section or something else.
The anthropologist can help the medical examiners determine which tools cut through the bones.
Here, there are very regular cuts, suggesting the use of a machine rather than a human using a tool by hand.
According to Officer Frank Nolot, the marks on the bones are compatible with the use of an electric saw.
An electric saw has enough power. It's like when you go to a butcher. They cut it with the saw and it cuts through instantly. There are no snags.
Nantes Hospital's Biological Institute then tells the investigators their findings. The arm, the leg, and the torso have the same genetic fingerprint, So they are from the same single victim. But who is this woman? You can tell from the very beginning of this case, Jean-Marc, that the investigation is likely to be very complicated. There's no crime scene to inspect. The places where the human remains were found are probably not the places where they were dumped. It's therefore particularly difficult to find clues that could lead to the perpetrator.
That's true. At the beginning of this case, apart from the forensic exam, the investigators have only two material elements to exploit. On the one hand, the garbage bags, and on the other hand, the stones that weighed them down. They must therefore focus on finding out where they came from.
We're dealing with a very distinctive modus operandi, an extremely shocking act. Not only did the murderer cut up the victim, but the body parts were also scattered in very far apart places. What can we deduce from this about the killer's personality?
Cutting up a body, terrible and shocking though it is, isn't necessarily a hallmark of a deviant who premeditated the crime. I've dealt with several similar cases myself, and on each occasion, the perpetrators cut up the body to dispose of it more easily.
More discreetly.
To dispose of the body more discreetly and more easily. The profiles of these people certainly varied between one and the other, but they were not mentally ill. These were, so to speak, ordinary crimes committed by ordinary people. Crimes of passion, committed out of hatred, out of revenge, out of jealousy. In all these cases, the perpetrators realized that it was easier to kill than to get rid of the body.
But you aren't ruling out in Janine Sopka's murder the theory of a crime committed by a sadist.
No, I'm simply saying that in this type of case, we must not be blinded by the horror of the crime and jump to conclusions.
Why, in your opinion, did the murderer dispose of the body parts in different places? By doing this, they would have increased the risk of being seen by witnesses.
Yes, of course. But I think at that moment it wasn't the killer's primary concern. It was to delay the identification of the body and by the same token, to delay the investigations that could lead back to the culprit. Remember, an arm was found without the hand. It was 2003, and in 2003, the perpetrator may not have known that we could identify people through DNA and not only through fingerprint comparisons.
Thanks to the specialists from the National Gendarmerie, we know that the corpse was cut using an electric saw. Could this information guide the investigation?
Yes, of course. We can deduce from this that the killer had access to a large and discreet enough place to cut up the body. We can also deduce that they knew how to handle electrical tools. This was a handy person. But personally, I find it hard to believe that a jigsaw or circular saw used by your everyday handy person could cut so cleanly through the thickness of a body.
The investigators' priority now is to identify the victim. They identify 8 women who have disappeared in the last 3 months in the north of France. Among them is a woman in her 50s who was reported missing 5 days before the first macabre discovery in Le Quignol. A toothbrush is taken from her home for DNA profiling. On March 16th, the police received the results of the biological tests. The specialists are resolute. The DNA extracted from the body parts belongs to a certain Janine Sopka. The victim, a 59-year-old pensioner, lived in the peaceful village of Saint-Hilaire-sur-Helpe.
We knew Janine Sopka a little. We immediately found out that these limbs were not only limbs, they were a person we knew. And so this aroused more emotion and empathy and even interest in the case. It was someone local.
Michel Coupillod was the mayor of the small town where Janine Sopka lived. His town hall is located a few yards from this quiet woman's home.
From here in my office, when she walked past, I kept an eye on the village. Whenever I saw her, she was well-dressed, young and attractive.
The police question all the people who live on the same street, including Eliane Meres, who lived just opposite Janine Sopka.
When she went to the car, she said hello, and that was all. She was polite and always well-dressed. She often changed her outfits and hair color.
Nora styled Janine Sopka's hair for over 10 years. She emotionally recalls this friendly customer.
She was someone I really liked. She would come in, and even if I wasn't in very good spirits, Janine would come in and lift my spirits. She always wanted a change, something new. She always wanted to be up to date with the latest trends. She wanted to be noticed. There you go.
Fernande Leduc was Janine Sopka's neighbor. She remembers her warm welcome when she moved into the neighborhood.
When I came out, she asked me, "Are you the new tenant?" "Yes, ma'am." And then she said, "Come in for a coffee and we'll get to know each other." That's how we became friends.
It's striking when hearing from the people who knew her how quickly she became friends with these people. She invited them over quickly. She was a kind-hearted person. You have to admit she was a lively person who could be passionate and joyful.
As they continue with their investigation, however, the detectives come across a contradiction. While very sociable, Janine Sopka didn't seem to have any close friends.
So it wasn't easy to figure out Janine Sopka's personality. Apart from her nice neighbor, who she saw every day, she had no close family or anyone who could talk about her.
Janine Sopka, a widow, no longer saw her only son and visited her mother very rarely.
At the time, her family didn't have information that could tell us what had previously happened in her life.
She's often described as someone with a strong personality. Moreover, over the course of her life, she gradually cut ties with her entire family. Notably, she was estranged from her only son, who didn't forgive her for his upbringing or lack of upbringing. She also cut ties with all her other family members. She was someone who, ultimately, her family found hard to bear.
After the first round of questioning, the police know that Janine Sopka lived alone. Her only income was a pension of 815 euros a month. The investigators interviewed her acquaintances and contacted family members she hadn't seen for years, without learning much about the victim. Did Janine Sopka have secret relationships? What was she hiding by refusing to answer questions about her past? Hoping to gather further information, on April 1st and 2nd, 2003, the police conduct a search of her home.
They want to arrive discreetly. They park right in front of the house. But a lady I know calls me and tells me, "I think the police are here." When we get there, the atmosphere is very heavy. They make it clear right away that they don't want any photos, and we should get out of the way of the investigation. We are given absolutely nothing.
The mayor of Saint-Hilaire assists with the search.
The police invited, or rather summoned me there, and I had to put on a white cap, a white coat, and some canvas shoes, and not move while they searched everywhere.
The purpose of this search is also to search for traces of people who may have visited Janine Sopka's home. They look for fingerprints. They also look for DNA. And they discover a certain amount.
In the bedroom, the specialist takes samples from several biological traces from a wall, the bedspread, and the shade of the bedside lamp. Janine Sopka's home is in order. The investigators discover no signs of a struggle or other elements to suggest that the crime was committed inside the small house. In the living room, several bottles attract their attention. Fernande Leduc admits that her friend's alcohol consumption increased a lot in recent years.
She didn't used to drink. What really happened? It's unfortunate that she started drinking like that.
During the search, some medication is found, which demonstrates that Janine Sopka was taking a lot of psychotropic drugs and antidepressants.
These discoveries, combined with new testimonies, allow the investigators to uncover the shadowy areas of Janine Sopka's personality.
Janine Sopka's dark side was, again, her ongoing mood swings that got worse with excessive alcohol consumption. She was clearly psychologically fragile, especially at the time of the events.
Behind the image of a cheerful neighbor, a portrait is gradually emerging of an unstable woman trying to end her loneliness by all means possible.
What's interesting is that she likes going on dates. She puts classified ads in the local newspapers, even our paper. We saw that she put a classified ad in the paper. Date with lady, age 59, looking for a man to share life with.
During the search, the investigators find 2 Lonely Hearts ads.
The first, well, there's no doubt about it. The second is slightly more scandalous, as it's an invitation for sex in no uncertain terms. It turns out that the second one wasn't written by her. First, it's not her handwriting, and second, there's a spelling mistake in her name.
Janine, 59 years old, still good looking, owns a car, loves going out and partying, seeking men for fun. This unambiguous message, which was not written by the victim, discloses the pensioner's address. Who is the author of this classified ad? The police believe that Janine Suka was the victim of a malicious act. They also learned that Janine Suka didn't only publish classified ads to meet people. She regularly went to local bars and dance halls, in particular, the Robinson.
The Robinson is a very popular dance hall where there are tea dances every Sunday afternoon, sometimes in the evening. This place is on the N2, the highway that goes from Maubeuge to Paris. It's on the edge of a forest. It's a place where people eat, drink, and dance. It's packed on Saturday nights.
On Saturday, we left around 9. She couldn't care less. She was dancing, but I was sitting down. She always went to find admirers. Up to a certain point, she was happy just to dance. But then she took them home.
One night at 4 a.m., I heard her screaming. I looked outside. There was a man in boxer shorts. She had thrown him out.
Obviously, when the investigators found out about Jacqueline Suka's turbulent personal life, to put it mildly, they looked into all the lovers she had accumulated over the years leading up to her death.
During the search, the investigators discover a handwritten letter without an envelope.
At her house, a letter was found from someone called Paul Kiss, obviously an alias, which, in no uncertain terms, asked her for sex.
The police try to track down this mysterious Paul Kiss. The address written at the bottom of the letter is immediately checked. It doesn't exist. Some information obtained during the search is leaked to the newspapers. The residents of Saint-Hilaire-sur-Helpe discover Janine Suka's hidden life.
She got a reputation as a loose and flighty woman with many conquests. That doesn't go down well in small villages.
I think she would have liked, like everyone else, to have had a man of her own to spend time or her life with. But I think people judged her a little too much when they didn't actually know her.
The investigation has revealed that Janine Suka went out a lot and had casual flings. But in reality, she was a lonely woman who confided in very few people. This is bound to be an obstacle in the investigation of the murder.
Yes, in this case, the police can't rely on the testimony of family and friends as they usually do. They will have to investigate the places Janine Suka went to try to identify these one-night stands and fleeting conquests. We know from certain testimonies, particularly from her neighbor's testimony, that she happened to throw out a man she had brought back to hers. It could be that the killer was a man who felt deeply humiliated to be kicked out like that.
The investigation into her character shows that Janine Suka suffered from bipolar disorder, where she alternated between moments of euphoria and moments of irritability. The police will have to take this psychological fragility into account.
Yes, indeed. She had a strong character and was prone to mood swings. If we add to this her excessive consumption of alcohol and psychotropic drugs, this is the typical profile of someone vulnerable who can easily, and without even realizing it, put themselves in risky situations.
We've also discovered that Janine Suka published and answered classified ads. This information clearly opens an interesting lead for the investigators.
Yes, there have been several criminal cases where the killer encountered the victim by responding to a classified ad in a newspaper. But this lead is extremely difficult to follow, because newspapers only play an intermediary role by directly passing the responses on to the receipts, without reading their contents. Only Janine Suka herself could know who responded to these classified ads. Letters could have turned up during the search of her home, but unfortunately, that wasn't the case.
However, the police found a document at the victim's house which showed that someone obviously tried to cause her harm by posing as her and writing down her full address. We discovered that this ad was published in a Free Maubert's newspaper on December 17, 2002, just 2 months before her murder.
Yes, this ad appeared in a local newspaper, but the newspaper did its job well, as it removed certain passages. In particular, it removed Janine Suka's address and the passages with sexual connotations. The person who wanted to publicly tarnish Janine Suka's reputation and attract strangers looking for sex to her house missed the mark.
If the ad was published, it's because the newspaper received the submission. So how do you explain that Janine had a copy of it?
Well, I think the author of the classified ad sent her a copy to scare her. This person may have no connection to the murder. But in any case, I think this is someone close enough to the pensioner to know that she met men through classified ads.
The police set up their efforts to identify Janine's lovers. At the same time, they take an interest in the garbage bags in which the body parts were found. And they discovered that the label J19 printed on the plastic means that the bags were manufactured on January 19, 2003, almost a month before the victim disappeared.
The manufacturer was identified as a company based in Lorraine. The managers of this company were questioned. It was a painstaking process for the investigators to try to find out from the retailers who could have bought the bags.
The investigators learned that the garbage bags had been sold at several supermarkets in the region.
Unfortunately, most of these purchases were made in cash or were mixed with other objects, so it was impossible to identify who bought the bags, despite the thorough investigations that were carried out.
The police also tried to put their only other clue to use, the 17-pound stone found in the bag containing Janine Suka's limbs. Daniel Leclerc works as a stonemason a few miles from Avesnes-sur-Helpe. The investigators quickly come to question him.
The police came with a stone. They asked me what kind of stone it was. I looked at it closely. I gave it a small hit with a hammer. Because it was so old that its exact substance was hard to see. So I hit it with a hammer to get a small shard. And that's when I said, well, this is clearly a stone from Barbet.
The Marbet quarries are close by. By observing the stone that weighed down the bag, Daniel Leclerc is able to give the police other information.
The stone had been used because it had traces of mortar on it. So it was used about 150 or 200 years ago. And since there's whitewash and also a bit of earth on it, and tar has been applied, all of this was used in masonry for the foundations between doors and windows. That's what it was used for.
According to Daniel Leclerc, it could still be possible to find out which building the stone came from.
The foundations of the house must still exist. Even if the facade has been sandblasted, there's a strong chance this stone can be found. This kind of stone with a different grain texture and a different color. You could find out exactly where this stone came from.
So far, the investigations have yielded nothing, but the bags purchased in the region and the stone extracted from the Marbais quarries provide investigators with crucial information. The killer frequents the area.
They're on a local lead, and you can feel it. You can feel it because for a few weeks, there have been a lot of investigators working in Saint-Hilaire. We frequently see them questioning Saint-Hilaire residents.
It's not long before the newspapers share details of the murder.
This crime is barbaric. It's primal. You need a strong stomach to do this kind of thing. You have to be cold-blooded. It's hard work. It's horrible to imagine that the killer took their time.
Fabian, a forensic scientist and psychiatrist, has agreed to draw up a profile of the killer.
Dismembering a victim can either be strictly utilitarian behavior, to get rid of the corpse, or it can be part of the killer's problematic sexual fantasy. It's not always obvious whether it's due to the first behavior or the second.
But according to Dr. Obat, the wounds around the victim's nipples are telltale signs.
All mutilations of a sexual nature point to a perverted killer. In this case, there's a classic hallmark. There's no doubt about a mutilation of this type. There's no doubt about the perpetrator's intentions and psychological functioning.
All the locals follow the investigation's progress in the press.
There was a climate of panic. People went out less in the evenings. Young girls were allowed out less. Everyone was a little scared. Women stopped going home alone at night.
It's very heavy. There's a strange atmosphere in the surrounding villages. Throughout all the villages in Avenois, in this rural environment, it's all anyone talks about. Clearly, it's weighing heavily.
The police try to reconstruct the victim's final hours as soon as possible. While going through Janine Sopka's phone records, they discover that on the evening of her disappearance, the pensioner made a final call from her home at 7:25 p.m. The investigators identify the caller. It's a man who lives in Avesnes-sur-Helpe. Why did Janine Sopka call him? What did they say to each other? Did they see each other that night? To answer all these questions, the police bring this individual in on March 13, 2003. When asked about his connection to Janine Sopka, the married man immediately admits that he was the victim's regular lover.
Besides relationships that can be described as short-lived, there was nevertheless a point of stability in Janine Sopka's love life. This man with whom she had an affair, a close relationship for several years, with ups and downs, of course. In the end, despite the breakups that marked their affair, they always patched things up afterwards. They always went back to each other.
When she spoke to me, she always talked about the same person. I think she was in love with that man. It was love more than just a fling.
The man, who had an adulterous relationship with Janine Sopka for more than 2 years, tells investigators that on February 19, 2003 at 7:25 p.m., his mistress called him to unexpectedly invite him to dinner in Avesnes-sur-Helpe. Patrick Carlier runs the restaurant. He remembers this couple who regularly came to his establishment.
They looked like any couple. They were Mr. and Mrs. We never suspected that they were having an affair. They always sat in the same place. Always. When they came, they always got either 1 or 2 steaks or mussels. He didn't talk much, but she was smiley. She was a customer. We didn't know much more about her.
The night she disappeared, Janine Sopka had dinner with her lover at Patrick Carlier's restaurant.
It was a Wednesday, I think. So there weren't many customers. How many were there? 10 or 15 people? And when they came, they surprised us. Because they offered us a drink that night. They offered us a drink because they were splitting up.
The police continue with their interrogation and take the opportunity to collect a DNA sample from Janine Sopka's lover.
He said that that evening, Janine Suka asked him to return her house keys and not to call her until the following Monday, and that she wanted to be left alone until then. He didn't know why, but he was used to his mistress's mood swings and shenanigans. In any case, he knew, because this wasn't the first time this had happened, that in a few days she would call him and they would make up. There was no argument at all. Nobody saw it, and he denies it.
According to the customers who were at the restaurant that evening, the meal took place without any rows or raised voices. The couple left the establishment at around 9 p.m.
According to this man, Janine Suka wanted to walk home. Let's not forget there's a distance of nearly 2 miles between the restaurant and her home in Saint-Hilaire-sur-Helpe. Her lover offered to drive her home. In the end, she accepted. She got into the car, and then after only a few dozen yards on Aulnoy Street in Avesnes-sur-Helpe, she told him, quote, "I'm going to walk, drop me off here," end quote.
The man explains to the investigators that Janine Suka got out of his car outside 35 Aulnoy Street near the Captain's Bridge, a small railway bridge that marks the boundary between Avesnes-sur-Helpe's last houses and the surrounding countryside.
It's just outside the city. You can see the divide between the urban and the rural environment. She was dropped off there. It was pretty dark. At 9:30 p.m., it was dark.
The man claims that he then drove for a few dozen yards before stopping his vehicle. Feeling guilty, he waited for his mistress to decide to get back in his car. It was a cold night, 25 degrees and already very dark, but Janine Suka never reappeared. The genetic testing laboratory sends results to the investigators. The specialist isolated the man's DNA from the samples taken from Janine Suka's bedroom. But this discovery doesn't provide the police with any concrete evidence against this man, who has never kept quiet about his intimate relationship with the victim. At this stage of the investigation, the individual is the last person to have seen Janine Suka alive. The police must now check if his statements are true. They also search for testimonies about his character.
He's a man of good standing, who's never had problems with the law. He's described as calm, even impassive by some. He never gets angry, never drinks alcohol, and kept his composure when it came to his mistress's multiple infidelities, because he was clearly aware that Janine Suka was seeing other men. In any case, he seems devoid of any passion that could drive him, out of jealousy, to take revenge on his mistress. Because since he found out, if he was going to react, he would have done it a long time ago.
The man claims to have returned to his home at around 9:30, after dropping Janine Suka off at Aulnoy Street. When questioned, his wife confirms his alibi, adding that her husband didn't go out again that night.
Here, we're forced to consider the psychology of the concerned parties. The wife of Janine Suka's regular lover is perfectly aware of her husband's adulterous relationship. It seems unlikely to me that she's lying to give him an alibi. In any case, there's no proof of that.
While questioning this woman, the investigators make a surprising discovery. The deceived wife confesses that she wrote the classified ad with sexual connotations found at the victim's home. She was the one, out of a desire for revenge, who wanted to stir up trouble for her husband's mistress. Despite this admission, there's no evidence connecting this woman to Janine Suka's murder. Her husband is also exonerated. But on April 7th, the police receive an anonymous letter which claims that on the morning the victim's limbs were found, Janine Suka's lover was on the banks of the Sambre-Oise.
The letter accusing him is anonymous. It's vague. It doesn't give the identity of the witness who allegedly saw the concerned party on the same day that Janine Suka's limbs were discovered in Le Quignol. It's completely unusable for the investigators.
The police are surprised that the anonymous letter writer is so well informed. The investigators are the only ones, along with the murderer, who know that the garbage bag was deposited on the banks of the Sambre at night or in the early morning.
We can assume that it's the murderer who is trying to set the police on a false lead.
Who would want to send the investigators after Janine Suka's lover? Could the letter writer be a jealous man? Was Janine Suka the victim of a crime of passion? The police investigate all the men with whom the victim was romantically involved.
Among all these lovers, there was one relationship that may have been a little longer and a little more turbulent than the others, since several witnesses reported fights. Several of Janine Suka's neighbors said they saw her leaving her home with blood on her face. At his home, an envelope containing Janine Suka's pubic hair is discovered. It also turns out that for a while he was literally harassing Janine Suka.
On October 13, 2003, this man is questioned by the investigators. He immediately explains that he couldn't have committed the crime because he was in hospital on the night of Janine Suka's disappearance. His alibi is checked and confirmed. This individual was at a clinic in Valenciennes from February 18th through 20th for heart disease treatment. Another lead has closed. Don't you think, Jean-Marc, that the lead of the regular lover was abandoned by the police rather quickly? To recap, he was the last person to see Janine Suka alive, and his alibi was corroborated only by his wife, who, as we well know, did not particularly care for the victim.
Yes, that's true. But the elements that seem to work against him are not, in the eyes of the law, proof or even close to it. The police have carried out numerous investigations into this couple and have not found any material evidence against them. So let's be clear, their involvement in Janine Suka's murder has never been proven.
What do you think of the anonymous letter implicating the regular lover? Do you share the prosecutor's belief that the author of this letter could be the killer?
No, I'm not sure that the letter writer and the killer are the same person. This assertion is based on the fact that hardly anyone knew when the bags were deposited in the Sambre. However, remember, it was two workers from Le Quignol who discovered these bags and claimed that the bags were not there the day before. But in small villages, people talk and everyone knows everything.
So everyone could know?
So everyone could be aware, absolutely. However, it's certain at this stage that the person who wrote the anonymous letter is a local, since he knew about Janine's relationship with her lover.
Let's go back to February 19th, 2003, a little before 9:30 p.m., at the time of Janine Suka's disappearance, to the moment when she got out of her lover's car on Aulnoy Street near the Captain's Bridge. She seemed to vanish into thin air within seconds. Where did she go? Was she meeting someone? Did she have an unfortunate encounter? The investigators have to answer all these questions.
In order to answer these questions, they naturally interview the residents, the people who live around here. They discover a witness, a single witness, who reports hearing at around 9:30 a car stopping, someone getting out and having a heated discussion with the driver, then the door closing and the car leaving, which seems to back up the lover's statement. Then this witness claims not to have heard anything else. No other car, no screams, which seems to rule out the idea that Janine Suka could have been assaulted here by a stranger.
This bridge is 1.8 miles from Janine Suka's home. At the time of the incident, it was a dark and freezing cold night. Do you think she really intended to walk home in those conditions?
Janine Suka was in fragile health, so I can't imagine she would have decided to make such a long journey alone at night. Moreover, the police have ruled out that she could have hitchhiked. Everyone who knew her says she would never have got into a stranger's car.
But then why do you think she suddenly got out of her lover's car?
It's possible that she was planning on meeting up with someone she knew in the area. There's something that indicates this. Remember, during dinner, she asked her lover not to disturb her until the following Monday. Perhaps she had planned to meet this person after leaving the restaurant and to spend a few days with them.
On August 3, 2003, 5 months after the start of the case, new human remains are found. Half a leg and an arm without a hand are recovered by a swimmer in the Escaut Canal. Genetic testing again reveals Janine Sopka's DNA. These successive discoveries of bags containing body parts in far-apart places strangely recall a series of unsolved murders committed in Belgium at the end of the 90s, 30 miles from here. It all started on March 22, 1997, in a quiet suburb in the city of Mons. Ghislaine Bonaventure is a journalist. She followed the whole case for a Belgian television channel.
It's a Saturday. The weather is especially nice today. A policeman on horseback is on patrol and leaves Quim to head downtown. That's when his attention is captured by a cat playing with what looks very much like a human hand.
The cat was playing with a hand on a ripped garbage bag. The rider immediately alerted the federal police, who found 8 other identical bags nearby. At the time, Dominique Franck was the deputy public prosecutor in charge of the case.
As the deputy public prosecutor, first I sent the different garbage bags to an autopsy room in Mons. Then the bags were opened one at a time. An inventory was taken of what was inside.
At the time, the police thought the human remains came from the same victim. Dominique Franck will never forget the medical examiner's first findings.
I can picture it like I'm there. Someone says there are 2 feet and 2 hands, and the examiner says that's wrong. Everyone stops. I have 3 feet. That's the knockout blow. Everyone goes quiet. I don't know for how long, but everyone is silent. Each bag contains body parts: feet, hands, arms, legs.
The medical examiners determined that the human remains come from 3 female victims.
We realized then that we were crossing over the threshold into a horror that was totally different. And I think that was when we really became aware of the exceptional nature of our discovery.
The next day, the news of these macabre discoveries made the headlines. The press nicknamed the serial killer the Butcher of Mons. Frank de Chapelly Esquire is the attorney of one of the victims in this case. He remembers the climate of panic that took hold of the city.
A garbage bag was seen on a street where it shouldn't be, because it wasn't an official waste disposal point. The police were called. The police were called over a garbage bag because people were scared about what could be inside.
It was thanks to this, the vigilance of the citizens, that 2 days later, in another place called Le Chemin de l'Inquiétude, Anxiety Way, another garbage bag was found containing one of the victims' torsos.
Between March 22nd and October 18th, 1997, the Belgian police found the remains of 5 women scattered around the city. They soon became intrigued by the names of the places where the garbage bags were found.
There's a river called Hatred. Another is called Fear. A street called Anxiety. Is it a coincidence?
For the first time in their careers, the Mons police are facing a serial killer who seems to have organized a sinister game of treasure hunt.
We had to radically change the way we thought, because we knew nothing about serial killers. We didn't know how they worked. And so it was harder to put ourselves in their shoes, quite simply.
Given the scale and gravity of the case, the Belgian authorities created a special investigation unit called Corpus, made up of 15 police officers. When in 2003 Janine Sopka's limbs and torso were found, the French police, who knew about the Butcher of Mons case, reached out to their Belgian colleagues.
When France got in touch with the Belgian authorities, it was extremely important. Why? Because the investigation was in a rut, and the Corpus unit was a bit stuck. So this was a new hope, especially since this hope seemed to be backed up by several facts that suggested we were dealing with the same person.
Of course, there are the characteristics, the modus operandi. Janine Sopka disappeared one evening in February 2003, and then cut-up body parts were found in garbage bags, notably in Vieux-Condé and in the Escaut, just over a mile from the place where, years earlier, the pelvis was found of one of the victims from Mons. That's nothing to sneeze at.
The French police notice another similarity. The place where Janine Sopka's body parts were found also bear names that are reminiscent of the Mons case. The vile discovery in Loquignol occurred at a canal in a place called La Hachette, hatchet.
The garbage bags were found in places with particularly evocative names like Hachette, hatchet, or the town of Vieux-Condé, near Valenciennes, which means cop. They were names that meant something.
The French police also noticed that the dismemberment of Janine Sopka's body recalls the Butcher of Mons victims.
It's true that there are similarities between both cases. Each time, the dismemberment has been done cleanly. The cuts go straight through.
The breasts were also mutilated, with the tips severed. And then, strangely enough, I learned that Janine Sopka was mutilated in the same way.
All these things, for me, are specific and consistent enough to deduce that it's probably the same man behind these crimes. Anyone with an ounce of reason would think this is the same case.
According to the psychiatrist Fabian Aubard, similar operating procedures can support the idea of a single killer.
A very repetitive method of getting rid of a body, using the same means, naturally suggests the same perpetrator. I think this man could probably have used more sophisticated methods to get rid of the corpse. It's both concealment and exposure at the same time, because the bags were found quite easily. So this is someone who I think is leaving a trail of breadcrumbs.
Even with these breadcrumbs, there are no clues as to the organized and perverse killer's identity. Despite the limited information at their disposal, the Belgian investigators from the Corpus unit managed to identify the 5 victims in Mons thanks to missing person files and several appeals to witnesses in the press. They were Carmelina Russo, age 44, Martine Bayonne, age 43, Jacqueline Leclerc, age 33, Natalie Godard, age 21, and finally, Begonia Valencia, age 37. Could Janine Sopka be the Butcher of Mons' 6th victim?
We have nothing. Without knowing where the bodies were cut up, with nothing but bodies cut to pieces, there's no way to connect anyone to these crimes. Unfortunately, all that can be done, and this is one of the case's biggest problems, is to go through a whole series of theories. What do we actually have? We have victims. That's all we have in this case. Victims in pieces. We have a case in pieces with victims in pieces.
During their investigations, the Belgian detectives from the Corpus unit tried to retrace the Butcher of Mons' victims' steps. They hoped that by studying their profiles, they might find similarities that could lead them to the killer. While comparing the Belgian victims to Janine Suka, the French police discovered they have several things in common.
In the Mons victims' lives, and in Janine's life, there's a huge similarity with the family breakdown. Practically no family. They're alone, single, and like meeting men.
Janine
Suka was a woman who sought out flings. I think she had no family and was fairly isolated. Similarly, the Mons victims were lonely, depressed women. So, that's interesting.
Without exception, all the victims of the Belgian serial killer spent time in the Mons train station district. Here, the late-night hotels and bars are frequented by oddballs and outcasts.
They were lonely, isolated women. So they were looking for human contact, and that's probably why they hung out at the bistros around the Mons train station. Because in these bistros, there are lost souls who want to talk to someone to feel less alone.
Janine Suka was also looking for human contact. Testimonies revealed that she visited many bars and dance halls on both sides of the border. However, she was never reportedly seen in Mons.
People were questioned in the vicinity of the station, and it turned out that nobody recognized Janine Suka from photos.
The Corpus Unit investigators looked for other places that might connect the Butcher of Mons victims.
There's a rumor that all of them had spent time in psychiatric facilities.
Ghislaine Bonaventure has been looking into the Butcher of Mons victims for a long time. She has carried out her own investigations. A psychiatric facility in Mons, where two of the victims had stayed, captured her attention.
There are only 2 on file, but I contacted some staff members from this psychiatric hospital, and it turns out that 4 of the 5 victims of the Butcher of Mons were either hospitalized or had appointments at this institution.
Janine Suka, many years before her disappearance, was hospitalized in mental health facilities. She was hospitalized in a number of institutions, but these institutions were all in France.
Disturbing parallels are drawn between the Mons victims and Janine Suka. However, the investigators can't find a concrete link that unites these two cases. In the end, a more in-depth comparison of the methods used to cut up the bodies seems to suggest that the Butcher of Mons is not Janine Suka's killer.
Autopsies are obviously part of the case. As a reporter, I don't know much, except for some things provided at the time by the prosecutor's office. I know the victims were cut up with a handsaw.
In France, the medical examiners determined that an electric saw was used.
And that was decisive in saying that Ms. Suka's death was not linked to the deaths of our victims.
The investigation into Janine Suka's death now turns towards the lead of a copycat killer.
The case had a fair amount of publicity in the Belgian media, so the Belgian newspapers gave quite a few details about the dismemberments, the bags left in places with evocative names and so on. So I think that we, along with the police, thought this was someone who wanted to copy.
Despite the many similarities between Janine Suka's murder and the still unsolved crimes committed by the Butcher of Mons, The French police concluded that it was not the same perpetrator. This is due to two main things. First, the fact that, unlike the Belgian serial killer's victims, Janine Suka didn't spend time in the Mons train station area. And above all, the different methods used to dismember the bodies. Do you agree with their analysis?
I don't think we can be so certain. There are cases where serial killers change their modus operandi and also their areas of activity or hunting grounds. Only identifying and arresting the perpetrator will make it possible to say whether the murder of Janine Suka is related to the Mons case.
6 years passed between the crimes in Belgium and Janine Suka's murder. Isn't that another argument against the killer being one and the same?
No. There have been cases where serial killers stop their criminal activities for several years before resuming. This break could be due to several factors. Either they have undergone medical treatment that has reduced their criminal energy, or their social life has changed. That's possible too.
So a voluntary break.
A voluntary break. And there could also be involuntary breaks, such as the perpetrator being incarcerated.
What you're saying, Jean-Marc, is that Janine Suka could be one of the Butcher of Mons victims.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying that we can't definitively close this lead based on the arguments you're making. Although I admit, the probability that this is the same man is very low. I think a serial killer who started killing again wouldn't be satisfied with just one victim. They would start a series of murders again. But in this case, Janine Suka's murder was not followed by any similar incidents.
What do you think of the theory that Janine Suka's killer deliberately copied the butcher's modus operandi?
Rather than copying, I think he was inspired by the Belgian case, the details of which were covered widely in the press. This is not a copycat, that is to say, a killer who takes pleasure in imitating the modus operandi of a high-profile criminal. This is a man who's trying to muddy the waters. I think he only came up with this idea after killing and dismembering his victim. That was when he mutilated the breasts and then disposed of the bags containing the body parts in different places with symbolic or evocative names.
The police are now focusing their investigations on the local area. They go back to the very start of the case and interview all the people who live near Captain's Bridge again, in hopes of obtaining new testimonies. Very soon, one man grabs their attention.
He claims that he didn't see anything suspicious that night. But the police are still very intrigued by the aggressive comments he makes about Janine Suka. He calls her easy. He criticizes her for having many relationships with men. The investigators hear a whole series of aggressive comments that spark their interest.
The police learn that this man runs a sawmill. His business is therefore home to many large tools that could cut up a human body. The police try to find out whether this individual, who's behaving strangely, knew Janine Suka. They discover that the sawmill is located very close to the victim's home. Vincent de Moraes Esquire is the business owner's attorney.
It's a small village. They're both single. He has a sawmill. She needs wood. She gets wood from the sawmill. So they say hello to each other, if applicable, when they're passing through the village. However, neither of them has the other in their phone's contacts.
That may be the case, but we mustn't overlook a particular interesting detail, which is that her home and the sawmill are a few dozen yards apart. In other words, if you want to talk, there's no need to do it over the phone. It could have been done in person by Janine Suka going to the sawmill without leaving any traces or receipts.
The police investigate the man's personality to better understand his profile.
My client is a man with a pragmatic intelligence. He speaks in plain terms and he calls a spade a spade. So when it comes to describing a frivolous woman, he doesn't use the words I would use. He paints her as a floozy. His words might lack empathy, But I think that's the kind of man he is. He's a man who speaks his mind, a bit rudely.
He has a reputation for having a strong air of authority, or a strong personality, to quote some of his employees. He's a loudmouth, and he doesn't hesitate to use strong words to get his point across.
Emmanuel Renouard is a longtime employee of the sawmill. He remembers a direct but endearing man.
At work, if you made a mistake, he got crabby. For example, he would say to me, "Hey, Emmanuel, come here. This isn't okay." I would go see him, and he would tell me it wasn't okay and not to do it again. And that's how it would go. But he was a good person.
During the interviews, the police learned that at the time of the murder, the sawmill owner was going through a hard time. He was coming out of a very messy divorce, and his company was in trouble.
The company he set up is falling apart. Debts are piling up, and the markets are shrinking. So this is someone who's going through a number of disappointments. How does he deal with these disappointments? He turns more and more towards alcohol for comfort.
Marcel Boucheron is the man's longtime friend.
He didn't get much out of the divorce. On the contrary, it made him lose his willpower. Well, when you have problems, you turn to something. For him, it was drinking.
The police asked the sawmill owner where he was on the night of the murder. The businessman says he had dinner at his daughter's house like every Wednesday. When asked what time he came home, he claims it was around 9:30 p.m., the time that Janine Suka disappeared.
They asked this man, "What did you do?" "I did nothing." He's not going to make something up. He's not going to come up with an alibi. He's not going to look for someone who can cover for him. He's not going to ask his daughter to say he left later. None of that. He says, "I went home. I went to bed."
The investigators continue by studying this individual's phone records.
Every evening, when he comes home from work, he calls his voicemail to see if there are any messages for him. There's no exception to this rule. Over the 6 months that were checked, between December 2002 and May 2003, there were only 3 exceptions. On New Year's Day and Christmas Day, because we know that on those days he wasn't home, he was spending the holidays at his daughter's, and funnily enough, February 19th, the same day that Janine Suka disappeared.
The investigators surmised that since he didn't do that, and then the next day, he was a bit behind schedule at the factory in the morning, it's possible that he did something during the night. It's possible that he did something during the night. He'll tell you, "I was sleeping." When you live alone, when you go home to a small village where there's no one around and you go to work the next day, you can't prove that you were in a certain place. That doesn't make him someone who committed a crime.
On October 15, 2003, the police decide to take the sawmill owner into custody. They suspect that the victim went to his home on the night of the incident.
Janine Suka got out of her lover's car about 10 yards from the suspect's home. She didn't know anyone else on the street. As a result, it's quite plausible to imagine that, finding herself alone in the street, she turned to the only person she knew there, her neighbor.
The investigators are convinced that the suspect knows Janine Suka better than he's letting on.
There's a rumor that something might have happened between them, but nobody has ever seen anything. Nobody.
There were testimonies that turned out to be nothing but gossip, since when we tried to take the investigations a little further, it was always, quote, "I heard that, so-and-so said this," and then when we went to question so-and-so, we were met with, "No, I never said that." So these testimonies led to nothing concrete.
Even when they had him in custody, despite all that work, they realized they had nothing. They had no real evidence. They had some elements. If my client hadn't owned a sawmill, there's every reason to think they would have never been interested in him. If he had been a horticulturist, they wouldn't be asking the question, because if we removed that element, when he was in police custody, they had nothing else.
The sawmill owner is questioned at length, but the police don't get any information to back up their suspicions. That's when handwriting experts point to the businessman as the likely author of the anonymous letter that accused Janine's lover. They also think it's his handwriting in the sexually charged letter found at the victim's house, signed by a certain Paul Kiss. So the police decide to search the suspect's sawmill. The police force the staff to leave their workstations.
I arrived to find the village completely cordoned off by the police. There were almost as many police officers as residents. They surrounded the sawmill, arrested the owner, searched and cordoned off the area, and drew up plans. They interviewed all the sawmill employees one by one.
We thought there was a drugs bust in the village. They asked me to stop the machine. I went home, and then they summoned me to the police station. We all went to the police station.
With this surprise search, the police hope to find evidence of the suspect's involvement in Janine Supka's murder. Forensic technicians dispatched to the scene spray a light-based chemical to look for potential traces of blood.
They're very surprised to find it all over the workshop, especially directly above the saw on the ceiling, which suggests the blood squirted fairly high. Blood is also found at different levels in the workshop, including on the ground, and not only in the immediate vicinity of this saw, but also on another one, where they find blood inside the sawdust collector. There's a lot, not to mention that they also find it in the trunk of the main suspect's Renault 21.
When he's questioned about the findings, he says, "Look, I don't know. It's been a long time since we had an accident. There may have been an accident with a cut finger or something like that, but I have no other explanation." His defense is black and white. I'm not going to make something up. I'm not going to try and tell you I cut up a sheep for a party or something. I'm not going to tell you that I loaned my sawmill to someone and I came back to find it broken into. No, he says, I can't give you an explanation. Period.
The investigators' suspicions against the sawmill owner are growing.
Added to all these clues are some testimonies that are disturbing, to say the least. These testimonies come from employees at the sawmill, as well as a repairman who occasionally carries out repairs on the saws in the workshop. They say that at some point, the workshop smelled like a rotting carcass.
The repairman states that he noticed the smell of putrefaction in March 2003, just after Janine Supka was murdered. The day after the search, the sawmill owner is charged with first-degree homicide. The examining magistrate orders him to be immediately placed in pretrial detention.
As someone who's fairly well known locally, it's a scandal. It's like a bomb going off.
Everyone was saying they found the culprit. Some people in the village said it couldn't have been him and they were mistaken. Then there were others who saw him as the obvious culprit.
A few days later, the forensic technicians report their findings. The traces of blood found in the sawmill and in the victim's car are unusable. It's not even possible to determine whether it's human blood.
If there was blood, there were animals too. There were cats. At the back, there were ducks. A cat that's caught a duck might come in through the broken windows. There were holes this big in the doors. It could come in and eat its prey and then leave the rest behind so that it would stink. That would smell bad, and it's time to stop talking nonsense.
Since the results of the blood test don't formally incriminate the sawmill owner, the suspect is released after 9 days of incarceration on December 19, 2003.
The detention was detrimental for him. It messed with his head. He couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand it anymore. He didn't laugh like he used to. He wasn't the same.
I met him when he got out of prison. He came and he started crying. I told him, listen, I never thought you were responsible. Let's have a drink together. And then we would say hello to each other as usual at soccer games. But he was affected by it. 10 days in jail, I think it was about 10 days. That must shake you a bit. That must shake you a bit.
Helen Couture lived with the suspect after his release from prison. She supported him through those difficult years.
His daughter even asked me one day, "Aren't you scared of Dad after what happened?" I said, "I'll never believe your father did that. I'm telling you, he wouldn't hurt a fly."
Sick and devastated by his time in prison, the man dies 7 years later. Over those years, he never stopped protesting his innocence. According to his friends and family, it's impossible for this man to have committed the crime he was accused of.
If he'd done something, I would have sensed it. I would have sensed it in his words, in his look. He wouldn't have dared to look me in the face.
Helen Couture remembers her partner's last words.
The day he passed away, I was at the hospital because I went to see him every day. I did his laundry and everything. I got to the hospital, the nurses were all around him giving him insulin, and then he said, "It wasn't me. I swear it wasn't me." Before he died, he said, "I swear it wasn't me who killed her." He said that before he died. His last words.
After the man dies, the Aven sur Hell public prosecutor dismisses the case on April 10, 2013.
To be honest, as an attorney, the application to dismiss is thought-provoking. It's thought-provoking because it indicates that even if it's likely that there's more evidence against him, there's nothing concrete to say it was him. And in any case, the charges are dropped because he's dead, and the criminal proceedings are terminated.
In my application to dismiss, I summarized all the evidence to incriminate and exonerate him too. So if he hadn't died, would the charges have been dropped anyway? The question remains unanswered.
Unfortunately, this man died without being acquitted. And for him, that was extremely important. He wanted to be able to tell people, "I didn't do anything." I heard his last words from his family. His daughter told me. When he unfortunately died, that meant he wouldn't have his name cleared. He was waiting for his name to be cleared. He was waiting for them to say he had nothing to do with the case.
The dismissal of the case brought the investigation into Janine Suka's murder to an end. The application to dismiss was made after the death of the main suspect, who was still waiting to find out whether he would have to face a courtroom. His attorney regrets that his client was not exonerated during his lifetime.
To be completely clear, this order is not a posthumous recognition of his innocence. In the absence of other serious leads, the death of the main and only suspect in this case brings the investigation to a close, which makes judicial sense.
Moreover, the prosecutor told us that if the sawmill owner hadn't died, the charges against him might not have been dropped. However, it's clear, Jean-Marc, that the examining magistrate didn't have enough evidence to send him to court. Remember, the head of the company was indicted for 7 years before he died.
Yes, 7 years is a long time. It's very long in this type of case. This shows that despite appearances, this case was rather weak. It's obvious that his job contributed to most of the suspicions against him, since the police understandably believe that Janine Suka's body was cut using an industrial saw, a professional saw. But the police simply didn't have enough to go on. In particular, they were unable to establish that the head of the company knew Janine Suka.
There are still the graphologists who showed that he wrote to the victim under the pseudonym Paul Kiss, and that he wrote the letter accusing Janine Suka's lover.
Yes, but the graphologists didn't say it was the same handwriting. They said there was a disturbing resemblance between the handwriting in the two anonymous letters and the suspect's handwriting. Graphology is far from an exact science. It never offers irrefutable proof. In my opinion, it should be used and interpreted with extreme caution.
During the search of the sawmill, the forensic experts uncovered several traces of blood. Can you explain why they were unable to determine where it came from?
These traces of blood were not visible to the naked eye. They had to use a chemical to reveal them. They were probably small and very degraded, given the environment in which they were found, an environment full of sawdust and grease. To the extent that even though they could determine that it was blood, they couldn't determine whether it was human or animal blood, let alone extract any DNA from it. New tests have since been carried out. They also didn't reveal anything. It's clear to see that in this case, nothing is certain, even if it is true that the manager of the sawmill seems like an obvious suspect. Some believe he's guilty, others are convinced of the opposite. I would be careful not to express an opinion because ultimately there's no irrefutable evidence against this man.
As for me, I'm convinced that the killer is still out there. I'm convinced that we're not done talking about it. And one day or another, it will come out.
The investigation into the murder of Janine Suka made a deep impression on everyone involved.
It's a case that the investigators really took to heart and wanted to solve. They absolutely did not neglect any leads. I don't see what more could have been done in the investigation to get to the truth.
Whoever Janine Suka's killer is, French and Belgian investigators must continue working together.
If one day the person who murdered Janine Suka is found, there will of course be a thorough investigation to find out if this suspect could be the Butcher of Mons. I'm sure that after this show is broadcast, even after all these years, the Corpus Unit will still be collecting testimonies that can be cross-checked and verified.
However many years go by, the desire for the truth doesn't diminish.
I talk about her often. I think in the end, there's a killer on the run. It's been years. I hope that one day we find the person who did this. It's a monstrous thing to do. I think you have to be heartless.
Janine Suka's murder wasn't pursued by any plaintiffs, meaning that no member of her family tried to follow the investigation's process. This is fairly rare in criminal cases and a testament to the victim's solitary life. Only a few people were concerned about Janine Suka when she was alive, but the heinous crime of which she was a victim left no one indifferent. Given the brutality of the crime, the dismissal of the case seems like an admission of failure on the part of the justice system. Let's hope that new evidence will one day make it possible to reopen the investigation. Good night.